Thank you very much to the Center for Bhutan Studies for having us here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to present our findings. So as far as I know, our study, which has been conducted this summer, is the first GNH-based study in Eastern Europe. From what I have seen, it is also perhaps methodologically the closest to GNH as it is studied in Bhutan, because one of our intentions was to make it most comparable. So the actual physicality of the study, the conducting of the interviews, the gathering of data was processed by two of my colleagues, Jan Hartl and Pavel Fischer, who are not here with me today, but they are the leading sociologists at the STEM Institute, which is our leading institution, independent institution for sociological research. So we're not affiliated to anyone but ourselves, and we try to be as impartial and objective in our findings as we possibly can. And so the aim of the Happy Czech Republic Foundation was simply that when we traveled to Bhutan with a group of colleagues, one of them became the co-founder. He's a very successful entrepreneur, wonderful man, David Kirsch. As we traveled through Bhutan, we thought, wow, this country got something right. Now, there are things that we believe we are probably better at in Eastern Europe. Probably making money, probably organizing larger projects. We have a lot of expertise. We have incredibly strong academic resources we can rely on. But then when we come to Bhutan, there's something about the country that's really inspiring for most people. So we thought, okay, we want to find out what this is. And then we want to see if we can bring this closer to the people back home. Now, we are a similar sized country in terms of territory, not in terms of people. So we thought, well, let's see this gross national happiness thing that they talk about, whether we can take inspiration from that, and that's what we tried to do. So we tried to measure happiness. Now, our sample was over 1,000 people. It was strictly quoted to be representative, so it is a strictly representative sample, and we worked with adults specifically. Now, just to say, you know, there are 4 pillars, 9 domains, and the only thing we have done is we tried to stick to the methodology as far as we possibly could, but then we did adapt it slightly to fit the academic climate, to make it relevant to the current trends in our academia, and also, of course, we made certain adaptations in order to fit to a different socio-political, economic environment. So it's a different country. So if we look at what contributes to happiness, we see the Bhutanese model, and you can see our Western adaptation. Most of it is the same or very similar. The thing we struggled with the most is spirituality. Now, we are the most atheist country in Europe, so talking about religion and meditation could be deemed somewhat confusing, so that was the area that saw the greatest amount of adaptation. So you can see we used personal security, a sense of security, as a replacement, and although we do still have questions which talk about religion and spirituality, they are given slightly less importance than in the Bhutanese context. Apart from that, I think we kept it very, very comparable. Of course, there are certain questions we struggled with, like, for example, how many yak do you have in your household? Actually, if you translate the word yak to Czech, it's vůl, which means something similar to a yak as an animal, but also is very commonly used to describe a man of limited intelligence. So we thought that perhaps should we ask this question, a lot of married women would answer at least one. But whether we could then make the link between that and an increased level of happiness was a controversial question. So we decided to keep the yaks out. But as we continued, our findings were released very recently, and there is still a lot of analysis that needs to be done, and I will move on to that in a minute. But what we see in the findings is that there is a variety of implications, so political implications. We've just had parliamentary elections. One of the parties, that I believe is 6th largest in parliament, has actually used quite a few of our GNH findings to inspire their agenda. One of their leading members, the former Minister of Culture, Daniel Herman, was here in September and had very in-depth conversation about GNH with his Bhutanese counterparts, left very inspired and clearly inspired some of his party's ideas about what are the values that we want to base our society around. Basically, our fundamental aim is to start that conversation. What are the values? that we really deem important. Obviously, it's very recent that we have transferred to a market economy. It was in '89, after the revolution, that, with the liberalization, obviously, there was a lot of enthusiasm around material well-being. But, now, nearly 30 years on from that, people are beginning to realize that material well-being is fantastic as a baseline, but beyond a certain point, it doesn't help anymore. And so we as a society are also very demoralized. We have one of the lowest voter outcomes. We have a lot of issues in terms of what can we rally around, what can we agree on, what do we really stand for. We have a high level of corruption and an even lower level of confidence in our political, juridical, which are some of the findings we came up with actually. Over 70% of the people do not believe in the impartiality of courts. They do not believe in the impartiality of the police force, of other services. And, that was actually one of the most alarming findings we had. And so for us as a foundation, using GNH really is a tool to ask, okay, so what are the things we care about? Incidentally, Fischer, who was one of the leading sociologists on the study, is running for president. We have the presidential elections in January. And obviously his mandate was partly inspired by what we have found through this joint collaboration. So the political implications have been pretty direct so far. Now, academic, certainly we work with the University of Olomouc, and they are helping us to analyze and to move further in the debate. They have a good exchange scholarship program for Bhutanese students. So they are delighted to share in our passion for GNH and, of course, social debate. We want to stir social debate. We want to make people think and talk about what we see in numbers. In numbers, it's sometimes easier to see than we know. We all know about the epidemic problems, but then when you have the data to support it, it makes the conversation easier to start. And then, of course, business. So here we are to talk about business. And so when it comes to business, obviously we now have a large amount of data, good data, well-gathered data, academically robust data, but what do we do with it? Now, the amount of links and correlations that can be made between over 120 questions, the answers to those questions, is immense, right? Correlation obviously does not imply causality, which is one of the greatest challenges in the social sciences as such, but particularly in our study. So if, happiness levels correspond to something, does that mean they are related, or is it an incidental causality? Is it an incidental correlation? And then, of course, are we then allowed to make logical leaps of the imagination? Or are we going to stay very conservative and say, no, we cannot be sure, and so we don't make the claim? Yes, thank you. Okay, so here are some of our findings. I just want to give you a few samples and how we went on to think about them. This was happiness by material satisfaction. So very interestingly, you would think that financial material satisfaction would be directly correlated. It's not. Actually, some of the happiest people on your left, some of the richest people on your left, are not so happy. In fact, they have a very large group of people which are not happy at all. And our happiest are the, so to speak, upper middle class, then the middle class. So that's a very interesting consideration when we talk about business, because the whole philosophy of increasing profits, increasing margins, growth and growth and growth is based around a founding idea that financial success will lead to greater well-being of some sort. Our study clearly shows that it's not necessarily so. And beyond a certain point, increasing in material satisfaction does not lead to an increase in happiness or satisfaction overall. So that was one of our more surprising findings. The one I personally find very, very inspiring is this one. One of the most direct correlations we found was with the level of education. So the more educated a person is, the happier they are. Actually, irrespective of their material satisfaction. And I think that's brilliant. I think that's a brilliant argument for investing more in our education system, investing more time and more effort. And in a business context, of course, we can translate that to, schooling people, making sure they have enough time to develop professionally, making sure they have the opportunity to grow, making sure that as part of their package, they receive ample opportunities to study and increase their qualification would lead, we can assume, to a probability in their increase in happiness. And of course, I'm not going to repeat, everyone said that today, we have so much data to support that happier, well-satisfied people work better. So we know that having happy workers is a good thing we want to strive towards. Interestingly, specialization was a very big thing. Now, students studying, right, are among the happiest, and then people who tend to have more, and again, that's me making a leap of the imagination, as I did warn you, people who have more creativity in their job, not necessarily decision-making power, but more creativity tend to be of the happier, and people who tend to have less creative jobs, but who are following some sort of a rigid structure, where they have little influence of the process, little say in the process, tend to have lower happiness levels. So that's just to think about the fact that, you know, in business, obviously what people do, how creative they can get, how much influence they have over the area in which they're working can also have a significant impact. Gender has been noticed, statistically insignificant, yet interesting. Men are happier than women. So we can think about things like maternity leave, childcare, daycare centers. You know, how does it reflect in women's ability to get and maintain work? The fact that they're of childbearing age, which is a huge problem in Europe. I mean, it is still very normal for Eastern European companies to say, do you have children? Do you plan to have children? Are you married? Do you plan to get married? You know, questions of a personal nature that should be absolutely unacceptable and yet are being asked. And women of childbearing age with no children have a much lower chance of being hired on the presumption that she will get pregnant and leave. So we will have to pay her maternity leave. Why would we want to do that to ourselves? Let's hire an older woman or a man. You know, so gender is a funny one, and it has huge implications, potentially statistically insignificant yet interesting. Now, political party, and here our analysis is perhaps the most far-fetched, but people who tend to vote more right-wing parties tend to be happier. People who tend to vote in the Czech Republic, that is obviously more left-wing parties, tend to be less happy. So for us, right-wing parties are very much those that support entrepreneurship, that support a certain degree of self-responsibility, and left-wing parties are very, very heavily based in their agenda on the welfare state. You know, it's the state's responsibility to provide you with a job, with an income. And so there seems to be some kind of a correlation between people's more entrepreneurial, more independent spirit and their ability to be happy. Maybe it's their ability to take responsibility for their own lives and their own happiness. I don't know. But here there is a statistical significance, so it is something to think about. Especially in our context, where politics is currently very volatile. This finding was very controversial, and there was a lot of talk. So if nothing else, we stored debate.
1 minute remaining.
Yeah, health is an obvious one. So taking good care of your employees will probably make them happier. But this is hardly surprising, and obviously health is going to be a fundamental factor in how happy we feel in our lives. Now, there are many potential further considerations. For example, people who had greater involvement in philanthropy tended to be happier. So can we then say that corporate responsibility and giving back schemes, charity involvements, humanitarian projects, which are taken on by corporations, can enhance happiness in business? I think it's not an illogical leap of the imagination, whether it would be supported. Obviously, 130 questions, you know, many more considerations that were and could be made. Now, what next? So obviously we are going to head into further analysis with STEM itself and with Olomouc University. But we are very open to collaboration, to extrapolation, and that is an invitation to whatever other GNH societies and agencies there are out there. Should you wish to work together, we would be so delighted. Learning from different cultures, contexts, you know, comparing results, making international comparisons. Again, you know, we would love to be able to see how our findings, your findings, our methodology, your methodology. So that's, you know, our open invitation to whoever feels that we could find common ground. And for us specifically, so our next project is developing what has been already presented here, which is a screening tool and a certification scheme for our businesses, because yes, we believe that creating motivation, if only as a stamp of approval, of saying, yes, this business is, you know, GNH friendly, it looks after its people, could help companies to think maybe a little more, maybe smaller companies that haven't had the chance to think, haven't had the time, haven't had the resources, to think about taking better care of its people. And all three of us, all three founders of the GNH Foundation for Czech Republic, we are all entrepreneurs, we all have different sized companies, and fundamentally for us, we never named it GNH before we came into contact with Bhutan, but we always tried to be more children-friendly, more flexible. We always tried to establish a very different set of rules upon which we built the hierarchies in our companies. So for us, it was a natural step then, once we came into contact with GNH, to say, wow, they have the methodology, they have a framework figured out already. So let's see if we can make use of this to make our methods even better. And then maybe we can find something in the process that we can offer back to them. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And come and visit Prague if you have a moment.